What happens when a cold-hearted billionaire makes a decision that leaves everyone speechless? Alexander Hale, a man known for his ruthless business tactics, does something completely out of character. He adopts Ethan, a boy living on the streets. The world is quick to judge, calling it a publicity stunt or a desperate attempt to fill a void in his life. But beneath this shocking act of kindness lies a hidden truth that neither Alexander nor Ethan could have predicted. Get ready for a story that will take you on an emotional roller coaster, where each revelation hits harder than the last, and where the true meaning of family is redefined. You won't believe how it ends. Don't miss this journey that will leave you with tears in your eyes and hope in your heart. In the heart of the bustling city, a shadow of a man known for his sharp business instincts and a heart seemingly made of ice, made a decision that left everyone in shock. Alexander Hale, a reclusive billionaire with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, did something completely out of character. He adopted a homeless boy off the streets. The child, Ethan, had spent his short life surviving in the unforgiving alleys of the city. Alexander's decision spread through social circles like wildfire, igniting whispers, suspicions, and relentless media coverage. Why would someone like Alexander Hale do such a thing? The elite society murmured in disbelief. To the public, it seemed like a calculated move or a publicity stunt, just another game for a man who controlled industries with the flick of a wrist. Yet, beneath this seemingly cold act of charity lay a story that no one, not even Alexander's closest confidants, could have imagined. He wasn't merely adopting Ethan out of pity. He was running from his own demons, haunted by a past he had locked away in the deepest corners of his mind. One crisp morning, Alexander sat in his office on the top floor of his skyscraper, staring at the adoption papers laid out before him. The room was filled with the sterile scent of wealth and success, polished mahogany, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city like a king surveying his kingdom. He was a man used to making decisions with surgical precision, never hesitating, never second-guessing. But today, his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the pen. This was not a deal. This was not a negotiation. This was a leap into the unknown. He signed his name with a firm stroke, releasing a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The moment the ink met the paper, his life shifted imperceptibly, as though the world had tilted on its axis. He knew that whatever lay ahead, it would be something he could neither predict nor control, a terrifying thought for a man whose life was built on predictability. Later that day, Alexander found himself standing in front of a rundown orphanage, the place where Ethan had lived after being plucked from the streets. The building seemed to sag under the weight of its neglect, cracked walls, shattered windows, and a sense of abandonment that seeped into the air. As the gates creaked open, a small figure appeared. A boy, thin and wary, with tousled hair and eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. Alexander had faced corporate giants, stock market crashes, and hostile takeovers. Yet in that moment, he felt utterly lost. "Hello, Ethan," Alexander said, extending his hand awkwardly. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't smile, didn't move, just stared at Alexander with a gaze that seemed to pierce right through him. A gaze that held no hope, no trust, only a deep, guarded curiosity. Alexander's wealth, his power, his perfectly ordered life, all seemed utterly useless in the face of that silent, penetrating stare. And so, the news broke. Alexander Hale adopts Street Boy, the headlines blared, filled with skepticism and gossip. Some speculated he was trying to buy himself a better image, while others thought loneliness had finally caught up with the man who had everything but a family. But no one, not even the cynics who tore apart his every move, knew the truth that Alexander carried, a truth that not even he was ready to confront. This was the beginning of a journey that neither Alexander nor Ethan could have predicted, a journey that would force them both to face their deepest fears and hidden sorrows, to tear down the walls they had built around their hearts. And in the process, it would become clear that this was never just about one man's act of kindness. It was about redemption, about finding a way back from the darkness that had consumed them both, and about the power of love to heal even the deepest of wounds. As the days turned into weeks, Alexander's mansion became Ethan's new home, a stark contrast to the harsh realities of the streets and the orphanage. The boy wandered through the grand halls, his small frame swallowed by the opulence around him. Everything in the house was pristine, cold, and too perfectly placed, like a museum where nothing felt truly lived in. Ethan's discomfort was palpable. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. Alexander tried to bridge the gap between them in the only way he knew how, by throwing money at the problem. He filled Ethan's room with expensive toys, the latest gadgets, and designer clothes that the boy barely touched. He arranged trips to amusement parks and tried to engage in awkward attempts at conversation. But no matter what he did, there was a distance between them, a wall that he couldn't break through. Ethan wasn't looking for luxury. He was looking for something far more elusive, a sense of belonging, a place that felt like home. The staff watched this awkward dance with wary eyes, and Alexander's attempts to connect only seemed to highlight his own inadequacies as a father. He was used to controlling everything, to making things happen just as he planned. But no amount of wealth or influence could force Ethan to open up to him. It was as if the boy's silence was a mirror, reflecting back all the ways in which Alexander had failed, not just Ethan, but himself. Then there was Alexandra, Alexander's estranged sister, who was less than thrilled about his sudden decision to adopt a child. She made her feelings known during one of her rare visits, her voice sharp as she confronted her brother in the study. "Alexander, you can't be serious about this," she said, her tone laced with disbelief. "You don't know the first thing about raising a child, let alone one from the streets. What are you trying to prove?" Alexander's face remained stoic, the mask of indifference that he had perfected over the years firmly in place. But inside, her words cut deep. He had spent his life building an empire, yet here he was, fumbling like a rookie in the one area that seemed to matter most now. Without a word, he turned and left the room, leaving Alexandra shaking her head in frustration. As Ethan settled into his new life, he also began attending a prestigious private school that Alexander had carefully selected. But instead of a fresh start, school turned into a battleground. The other kids whispered behind Ethan's back, pointed fingers, and threw glances that reminded him of his place in the world. "Isn't that the street kid Hale adopted?" they sneered. Ethan's fists would clench under his desk, the fire of anger and humiliation burning in his chest, but he kept his head down, hoping to blend into the background. One afternoon, the whispers turned into taunts, and the taunts escalated into a confrontation. A group of boys cornered Ethan in the playground, their faces twisted with smug superiority. "Think you're special because a billionaire picked you off the streets?" one of them sneered. "You're just a stray dog he felt sorry for." Before he knew it, Ethan's control snapped. The rage that he had bottled up for so long exploded. He lunged at the boy, fists flying, the years of pain and rejection pouring out in one violent moment. When the dust settled, Ethan stood trembling, his knuckles bloodied, the other boy on the ground with a look of shock and fear etched across his face. The call came to Alexander immediately. He arrived at the school with a familiar heaviness in his chest, as though this confrontation was inevitable. When he entered the principal's office, he found Ethan sitting alone, staring at the floor, his face a mask of defiance and hurt. Alexander sat across from him, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. "What happened?" Alexander asked, his voice softer than Ethan had ever heard it. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the ground, his voice barely a whisper. "They called me trash. Said you only took me in because you felt sorry for me. They said I don't belong." Alexander's heart twisted, both in anger at the cruelty of the world and in his own helplessness to make it right. He had thought he could protect Ethan, could shield him from the harsh realities of his past, but he realized now how naive that hope had been. Without a word, Alexander reached out, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder, not as a billionaire or a man of influence, but simply as someone who understood what it meant to carry the weight of feeling out of place. "You're not defined by where you came from, Ethan," Alexander said quietly. "You don't have to prove yourself to anyone. What matters is who you choose to be, not what they see you as." Ethan finally lifted his eyes, searching Alexander's face for any hint of insincerity. Instead, he saw something he had never expected, a vulnerability, a crack in the armor of the powerful man he had come to live with. It was the first time Ethan felt that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in his struggle. The days passed, and their bond, though still fragile, began to show signs of growth. Alexander made an effort to be home more often, stepping back from the demands of his empire to focus on the one thing that mattered more to him now: Ethan. They began to share simple moments together, like eating dinner at the same table or watching a movie in silence, the space between them slowly filling with a quiet understanding. One night, Ethan woke from a nightmare, the memories of the streets and the loneliness that followed him like a shadow haunting his sleep. As he lay there staring into the darkness, he heard footsteps outside his door. It was Alexander standing there, unsure of what to do, but unwilling to leave Ethan alone in his fear. He sat down on the edge of the bed, not saying a word, just being there. And for the first time, Ethan leaned into him, allowing himself to be comforted by the presence of someone who cared. In that small act, a connection was forged, a bridge between their two wounded souls. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And in that moment, they both began to realize that the road to healing would not be a straight path, but a journey they would walk together, one step at a time. The breakthrough between Alexander and Ethan, while significant, was only the beginning of a more complicated journey. Despite their small moments of connection, Ethan's adjustment to his new life remained a constant struggle. He was caught between two worlds: the cold streets he once called home and the glittering mansion that now felt more like a gilded cage than a refuge. Alexander could sense Ethan's internal battle, but felt powerless to help him. He had tried to fix things the way he always did, with determination and resources, but his wealth could not mend a broken heart. Then, just as he began to think he might never truly understand what Ethan needed, life threw them both a curveball that neither could have predicted. One evening, as Alexander was going through old photographs in his study, a collection he had kept hidden away for years, Ethan walked in, catching a glimpse of a picture that Alexander was holding. It was an image of a young boy, smiling brightly, with the same piercing blue eyes that Alexander had. Ethan recognized that look, that hidden sadness masked by a smile. His curiosity got the better of him. "Who is he?" Ethan asked, pointing to the picture. Alexander hesitated, the floodgates of his past threatening to burst open. He had sworn to never speak of this, not to anyone, but he knew the time for secrets had passed. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the photo back on the desk. "His name was Nathaniel," Alexander said softly. "He was my son, my only child." Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. He had never heard Alexander mention having a family before. As he stood there, taking in the gravity of Alexander's words, the older man continued, his voice heavy with a grief that had never fully healed. "Nathaniel died in a car accident," Alexander whispered, barely able to meet Ethan's gaze. "I was driving. I was distracted just for a moment, but that moment took him from me. I've spent every day since trying to punish myself, hiding behind my work, pretending that if I just worked hard enough, the pain would go away." Ethan stared at Alexander, feeling a strange mix of shock and empathy. For the first time, he saw beyond the billionaire's impenetrable exterior. He saw a man who was as lost and broken as he was, a man who had been carrying a burden of guilt and regret that no amount of success could erase. "I thought adopting you might be my way to make things right," Alexander admitted, his voice cracking. "But I realize now that I was wrong to think that way. You're not a replacement for Nathaniel, Ethan. You're your own person, and you deserve more than to be part of some twisted plan to redeem myself." Ethan felt his own defenses start to crumble. All this time, he had believed he was alone in his suffering, that no one else could possibly understand the pain of feeling unwanted, of feeling like a mistake. But now, seeing Alexander's raw vulnerability, he realized that they were more alike than he ever thought. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Ethan asked, his voice small, almost childlike. "Because I was afraid," Alexander said, wiping a tear that had slipped down his cheek. "Afraid that you would see me for what I truly am, a man who failed his own son. I thought that if I could protect you, if I could make things right with you, maybe I could forgive myself. But that's not fair to you, Ethan. It was never your job to fix me." The room fell into silence, but it wasn't the awkward silence that had marked their relationship before. It was a silence filled with understanding, with a shared grief that neither of them knew they had been carrying alone. Ethan looked at Alexander, and for the first time he didn't see a stranger trying to play the role of a father. He saw a man who was hurting, just like him. And in that moment, Ethan made a choice. "Maybe we can help each other," Ethan said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I don't know how to be someone's son, and you don't know how to be my dad. But maybe we can figure it out together." Alexander's eyes softened, and he reached out, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder with a tenderness that seemed almost foreign to him. "I'd like that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd like that a lot." For the first time, they embraced, not as billionaire and street kid, not as savior and lost soul, but simply as two people who had found something they didn't even know they were looking for, a second chance. But as they stood there, wrapped in that fragile moment of connection, the phone rang, breaking the spell. Alexander picked it up, his face darkening as he listened to the voice on the other end. It was the headmaster from Ethan's school. There had been another incident. Ethan had been caught in a confrontation with the same group of bullies. This time, it had escalated beyond just words. Alexander's anger surged, but it wasn't directed at Ethan. He was furious at a world that continued to punish a boy who had already suffered enough. Without thinking, he grabbed his keys, telling Ethan to get in the car. They drove in silence to the school, the air thick with tension and unspoken fears. When they arrived, the headmaster tried to lecture Ethan, treating him like a delinquent who needed discipline. But before he could finish, Alexander spoke up, his voice cold and precise, filled with the authority that could silence boardrooms. "Enough," Alexander said, his eyes locked on the headmaster. "This boy is not some charity case for you to look down on. He is my son, and I will not let anyone, not even you, make him feel like he's anything less than extraordinary." Ethan looked up at Alexander, his eyes wide with shock. He had never heard anyone speak up for him like that before. In that moment, something shifted inside him. A belief that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't just the kid from the streets. He was someone who mattered, someone who had a place in the world, even if he still didn't fully understand where that place was. As they drove back home, the silence in the car was different now. No longer the silence of two strangers, but of two people who had finally started to trust each other. Alexander glanced at Ethan, and for the first time he allowed himself to smile. A small, tentative smile, but real nonetheless. "You know," Alexander said quietly, "I'm proud of you, Ethan. Not because you're perfect, or because you don't make mistakes, but because you're trying. And that's more than I could ever ask for." Ethan felt his throat tighten, the words he had always wanted to hear lodged in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that he was worthy of love, that he was more than the labels the world had thrown at him. "I'm going to try too," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper but filled with determination. "I'm going to try to be the son you deserve." And for the first time, both of them believed that it might actually be possible. After that afternoon on the porch, the bond between Alexander and Ethan only grew stronger, though not without its challenges. Alexander's revelation about Nathaniel had opened a door between them, allowing them both to be vulnerable in a way neither had been before. However, healing was not a straight path. It was a series of setbacks and small victories, each one leading them closer to a place of understanding. Ethan still faced difficulties at school. The whispers and sideways glances didn't disappear overnight, and there were days when he felt the weight of his past pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. But now, instead of retreating into his shell, he would come home and talk to Alexander. They would sit at the kitchen table late into the night, Alexander listening to every word with the kind of focus and patience that Ethan had never experienced before. One evening, after another grueling day at school, Ethan came home looking exhausted but determined. He had been quiet during dinner, pushing his food around on his plate. Alexander, sensing that something was on his mind, waited until they were alone in the living room before he spoke. "What's bothering you, Ethan?" Alexander asked gently, setting down his cup of tea. Ethan hesitated, then looked up, his eyes full of both vulnerability and resolve. "I'm tired of running away from who I am," he said. I don't want to be ashamed of my past anymore. I want to do something with it. Turn it into something that can help other kids like me." Alexander felt a swell of pride as he listened to Ethan's words. He had been waiting for this moment. The moment when Ethan would realize that his story, no matter how painful, could become a source of strength, not just for himself, but for others. "I think that's a brave thing to do," Alexander said, his voice filled with admiration. "You know, I've been thinking about starting a foundation in Nathaniel's name, a charity to help kids who have nowhere to go, just like you once did. Maybe you could help me with it." Ethan's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with something like hope. For the first time, he felt like he could see a future that wasn't defined by his pain or his struggles. He nodded slowly, the smallest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'd like that," he said, his voice steady. "I'd really like that." As the weeks went by, they threw themselves into building the foundation. They worked side by side, planning events, organizing fundraisers, and reaching out to local communities. Alexander watched in awe as Ethan blossomed in this new role, no longer just the boy from the streets, but a young man with a mission, a purpose that burned brighter than any hardship he'd ever faced. Ethan began to speak at the events, sharing his story with an honesty and courage that left audiences moved to tears. The foundation quickly gained attention, not because of Alexander's wealth or influence, but because of the raw, unfiltered truth that Ethan brought to every speech. He spoke of his life on the streets, of the loneliness that had once consumed him, and of the unexpected love and redemption he found in the most unlikely place, a man who was as lost as he was. Alexander, for his part, felt something inside him begin to heal. He could see Nathaniel's spirit in every smile that Ethan brought to those who needed hope, in every word that Ethan spoke to inspire others. It was as if he was finally honoring his son's memory in a way that truly mattered, by helping another lost boy find his place in the world. But the most profound change wasn't in the foundation or the public's reaction. It was in the quiet moments at home. Alexander and Ethan's relationship shifted from awkward attempts at communication to a comfortable companionship. They became a true family, one that didn't need words to express how much they meant to each other. There were still arguments and misunderstandings, but they always ended with honesty and a deeper understanding. One night, as they sat on the couch after another successful charity event, Ethan turned to Alexander with a seriousness that made the older man pause. "You know, you're not just trying to make up for what happened with Nathaniel anymore," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You're doing this because you believe in it, because you believe in me." Alexander met Ethan's gaze, feeling the truth of those words settle deep within him. "You're right," he said softly, a smile spreading across his face. "This isn't about redemption anymore. It's about the future we're building, together." Ethan nodded, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he had found a place where he truly belonged, not because of his circumstances or because someone felt sorry for him, but because he was wanted, loved, and believed in. As they sat there side by side, they both knew that the journey that had brought them to this point was far from over. There would still be challenges, still be days when the shadows of their past tried to reclaim them. But they had learned something invaluable, that love was not about erasing the pain, but about facing it together, day by day, step by step. And in the quiet of that moment, as they looked out at the world that had once seemed so big and uncaring, they realized that they were no longer alone. They had each other, and that was enough. As the seasons changed and the foundation they built continued to grow, Alexander and Ethan's lives transformed in ways they could have never imagined. The two of them, once haunted by their pasts and defined by their pain, found strength in their bond, a bond that turned into a beacon of hope, not just for themselves, but for countless others who had once felt as lost as they did. The charity they created in Nathaniel's honor became a lifeline for kids on the streets, giving them a place to turn to, a reason to believe that the future could hold more than the suffering they had known. Ethan stood at the heart of it all, speaking from a place of raw, unguarded truth that captivated and inspired everyone who listened. He was no longer just a boy who was saved. He had become a young man who was determined to save others. At one of their largest events, a gala celebrating the foundation's first-year anniversary, Ethan took the stage in front of a crowd that included business tycoons, celebrities, and community leaders. He looked out at the sea of faces, his hands gripping the microphone, but this time, there was no fear in his eyes, only purpose. "I used to believe that my story was set in stone," Ethan began, his voice carrying a calm strength that silenced the room. "That no matter what I did, I would always be that kid from the streets, the one people looked at with pity or judgment. But then someone took a chance on me, not to fix me or change me, but to help me see that I had value just the way I was." He paused, his eyes finding Alexander in the front row. The man who had once been a stranger, who had once tried to use him as a way to fill his own void, now sat there with tears in his eyes, not as a businessman or a benefactor, but as a father. "Alexander Hale didn't just give me a home," Ethan continued, his voice steady. "He gave me a family. And in doing so, he helped me realize that my past doesn't have to define my future. That every one of us, no matter where we come from, has the power to become more than what the world expects us to be." The room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Alexander wiped away a tear, his heart swelling with a pride that went beyond words. For the first time since losing Nathaniel, he felt at peace, not because he had replaced his son, but because he had learned how to open his heart again, how to love despite the risks and the pain. As the evening came to a close, Ethan and Alexander stood side by side looking out at the people who had come to support them, who had come to be part of this journey they had started. Alexander turned to Ethan, a soft smile on his face. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for what you've done here tonight, but for the person you've become. You're everything I never knew I needed, and more than I ever deserved." Ethan looked up at Alexander, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd say this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'm glad you found me that day. I'm glad you took a chance on me, even when I didn't believe I was worth it." They embraced, a hug that was not just a gesture but a promise of a future where they would continue to stand by each other, no matter what came their way. In the weeks that followed, their lives settled into a new kind of normal. Alexander officially stepped back from his empire, dedicating most of his time to the foundation and to Ethan. They continued to share their lives in a way that was both simple and profound, filled with laughter, small disagreements, and a growing sense of trust that neither of them had ever known before. One crisp fall morning, as they were walking through the park where they often went to clear their minds, Ethan stopped suddenly, his face serious. "Can we go see Nathaniel?" he asked, looking up at Alexander with a kind of reverence. Alexander nodded, his heart tightening in his chest. It was a request he had never expected, but he understood its importance. Together, they went to the cemetery where Nathaniel was buried. The grave was simple, a marble stone etched with his name and a few words that spoke of a life cut too short. Ethan stood there for a long time, his hands in his pockets, staring at the gravestone. Finally, he knelt down, placing a small white flower on the earth. "Thank you," he whispered to the air, his voice cracking just slightly, "for giving me the chance to know your dad, for giving him the strength to be there for me when he couldn't be for you. I promise I'll take care of him, just like he's taken care of me." Alexander watched, his heart overflowing with a bittersweet mixture of love and sorrow. He knew that his journey with Nathaniel had come full circle, not because the pain had disappeared, but because he had found a way to channel that grief into something meaningful, something that honored both his lost son and the boy who stood beside him now. As they left the cemetery, hand in hand, Ethan looked up at Alexander and smiled, a smile that held all the pain, the hope, and the joy of the path they had walked together. "You know, you really are my dad," Ethan said, as if realizing it for the first time. "Not just because you adopted me, but because you chose to stay, even when it got hard." Alexander squeezed Ethan's hand a little tighter. "And you're my son," he replied, his voice filled with a quiet, unshakable conviction. "Not because I needed to replace anyone, but because you gave me a reason to believe that love is worth trying for again." They walked away, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink on the horizon, knowing that whatever challenges the future held, they would face them together. For they had built a family not out of blood or obligation, but out of the purest form of love, a love that heals, redeems, and turns even the deepest scars into the most beautiful stories. As they drove home, Ethan turned to Alexander with a grin that was both mischievous and heartfelt. "So, what's next on this journey of ours?" he asked. Alexander laughed, the sound full of joy he hadn't felt in years. "Anything, Ethan," he said, his eyes sparkling with possibility. "Anything we want." As they drove off into their shared future, the screen faded to black, leaving behind a story that wasn't about wealth or charity, but about the power of love to transform even the most broken of hearts. A story that reminded everyone watching that sometimes family isn't something you're born into. It's something you choose to build, day by day, moment by moment. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of love, redemption, and family. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends so that more people can experience the power of this inspiring story. And of course, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and powerful stories like this one. See you in the next video.